The tree that took 22 days to fall. When the cross-section finally hit the ground, the men stepped back and counted the rings. They started at the edge where the bark had been. Ring 1, ring 2, ring 10. They kept counting. 100 rings, 200. They were still nowhere near the center. By the time they reached the heartwood, they had counted over 1,300 years of growth. This tree had been a sapling when the Roman Empire still controlled Europe. When it had survived the Black Death, the rise and fall of entire civilizations, the birth of every nation that would eventually become the United States. And these 5 men from the California foothills had just killed it with hand drills and metal wedges in the summer of 1853. What they found inside that trunk would travel across the Atlantic Ocean. It would be displayed in London, Paris, and New York. Scientists would study it for decades. And the story of how they cut it down would become one of the most controversial chapters in American conservation history. Because this wasn't just a big tree. This was the widest tree ever measured and felled by human hands. 33 feet across at the base, so massive that the men who cut it could barely comprehend what they were destroying. This is the story of the discovery tree of Calaveras Grove. How they found it, why they killed it, and what its death taught America about the cost of treating nature as nothing more than a spectacle to be sold. The man who first brought the world's attention to the giant sequoias wasn't a scientist or an explorer. He was a hunter chasing a wounded grizzly bear through the Sierra Nevada foothills in the spring of 1852. Augustus T. Dowd worked as a hunter for the Union Water Company, one of dozens of outfits supplying the endless appetite of the California gold rush. The mining camps needed meat. They needed it constantly. Thousands of men were scattered across the foothills, panning streams and digging tunnels, and all of them needed to eat. Dowd's job was to disappear into the mountains for days at a time and return with deer, elk, and occasionally bear. The grizzlies of the Sierra Nevada were legendary. They could weigh over 1,000 pounds. They feared nothing. The native peoples who had lived in these mountains for millennia treated them with a respect bordering on reverence. The miners treated them as trophies and threats, shooting them whenever the opportunity arose. On this particular morning, Dowd had wounded a large male with a rifle shot that should have been fatal, but grizzlies are not easily killed. The bear had turned and crashed into the underbrush, blood marking its trail through the ferns and fallen needles. Dowd followed, rifle ready, hot expecting to find the animal collapsed at any moment. The chase took him higher into the mountains than he had planned. The terrain grew steeper, the air thinned. He was in country he had never explored before, tracking blood through stands of sugar pine and white fir that seemed to grow larger with every step. Then the trees around him began to change. The Douglas firs and sugar pines that dominated these mountains gave way to something else, something that didn't make sense. Dowd stopped walking. He looked up and up and up. The trunk in front of him was wider than any building he had ever entered. The bark was the color of cinnamon, deeply furrowed into ridges that looked like they had been carved by some ancient god. The first branches didn't begin until 100 feet above his head. The canopy disappeared into a haze so far above him that he couldn't see where the tree ended and the sky began. He had found the Calaveras Grove. Dowd forgot about the bear. He walked through the grove in a kind of trance, counting the massive trees. There were dozens of them, maybe 100. Each one seemed larger than the last. But one tree dominated all the others. It stood at the edge of a small meadow, its trunk so impossibly wide that Dowd couldn't see the other side when he stood against the bark. He paced around the base, counting his steps. It took him nearly a minute to complete the circle. When he did the rough math in his head, he calculated the circumference at over 100 feet. The diameter, he estimated, was somewhere around 33 feet. This single tree was wider than most of the mining cabins scattered across the foothills. You could lay 3 covered wagons end to end and still not span the width of its base. Dowd returned to the mining camp that evening. He told the men what he had found. They laughed at him. They called him a drunk and a liar. No tree could possibly be that large. Burst into the camp, claiming he had just killed the largest grizzly bear anyone had ever seen. This time, the men believed him. They grabbed their rifles and followed him into the forest to see the trophy. Dowd led them directly to the base of the massive sequoia. The men stood in silence. Some of them removed their hats. A few crossed themselves. They had come expecting a dead bear. Instead, they were standing before something that challenged everything they understood about the natural world. Within weeks, word of the discovery had spread to San Francisco. Within months, it had reached New York and London. And within a year, a group of businessmen had arrived at the Calaveras Grove with a plan to turn the largest tree into money. The decision to cut down the discovery tree was not made by scientists weighing the value of preservation against the demands of industry. It was made by entrepreneurs who saw a business opportunity. James Sperry and James Lapham owned the rights to the Calaveras Grove. They had purchased the land specifically because of the trees, but not to protect them. They understood that the giant sequoias represented something Americans had never seen before, something that would sell. The gold rush had created a new kind of economy in California. Men who had come for gold and found only hardship were desperate for entertainment, for novelty, for anything that would remind them why they had traveled 3,000 miles from home. The sequoias offered exactly that. But how do you charge admission to a tree? Sperry and Lapham had an idea. If they could cut down the largest tree and hollow out the stump, they could build a dance floor inside it. Then they could charge visitors to waltz on top of a 1,000-year-old giant. They could send sections of the bark to museums and exhibitions around the world, proving to skeptics that these trees actually existed. The tree would be worth more dead than alive. Now, before you condemn these men as simple villains, you need to understand the context in which they were operating. The concept of preservation, the idea that some natural wonders should be protected from commercial exploitation, it essentially did not exist in 1853 America. Forests were obstacles to be cleared. Rivers were power sources to be dammed. Wildlife was food to be hunted. The Sierra Nevada held more timber than any forest in the eastern United States. The idea that any of it might run out, that any single tree might be too valuable to cut, seemed absurd to men who had grown up clearing land for farms and fuel. Sperry and Lapham were not uniquely greedy. They were products of their time, and their time believed that nature existed to be conquered. But even in 1853, even before the conservation movement had a name, some people looked at the discovery tree and felt that cutting it down was wrong. The crew that Sperry and Lapham assembled for the job consisted of 5 men. Their names have mostly been lost to history, casualties of an era when working men were rarely considered worth remembering. What remains is their work, documented in journals and newspaper accounts that describe one of the most labor-intensive logging operations ever attempted. These men did not have chainsaws. The chainsaw would not be invented for another half-century. The 2-man crosscut saw existed, but it was still a relatively new tool in the California camps, and no saw manufactured at that time was long enough to span a 33-foot trunk. Even the longest felling saws stretched only 12 or 14 feet. This tree was more than twice that width. Instead, they used pump augers. These were massive hand drills, some of them 6 feet long, with spiral bits that could bore deep holes into solid wood. The principle behind them was brutally simple. Drill hundreds of holes in a ring around the base of the tree. Connect the holes using chisels and wedges. Eventually, the trunk would be so compromised that the tree would fall under its own weight. Simple in theory, savage in practice. The men started work in early June of 1853. The mountain mornings were cold, fog settling into the meadow where the discovery tree stood. By afternoon, the sun would bake the clearing with a heat that felt amplified by the surrounding forest. The elevation was around 5,000 feet, thin enough that physical labor came harder than it did at sea level. The first thing they discovered was that giant sequoia wood was unlike anything they had encountered in the eastern forests. Unlike anything most loggers had ever seen anywhere. The grain was dense and spongy at the same time, saturated with tannins that seemed to grab the auger bits and refuse to let go. The bark alone was 2 feet thick in places, composed of fibrous material that dulled their tools before they even reached solid wood. They developed a rotation system born of necessity. One man would work the auger, leaning his full weight into the crossbar while rotating the shaft. The motion was a modified push-up, over and over, hundreds of times per hole. Meanwhile, another man would operate a bellows, blowing sawdust out of the bore so the bit could continue cutting. A third would sharpen spare bits at a makeshift forge. The others would rest, drink water, prepare food, and wait their turn. Every few minutes, they would switch positions. The rhythmic chunk, chunk, chunk of metal biting into ancient wood echoed through the grove from first light until darkness made work impossible. Progress was measured in inches. On a good day, with sharp bits and favorable grain, they might complete 4 or 5 holes. Each hole took hours of sustained drilling. The auger bits were designed for softer woods, pine and fir, and the sequoia heartwood destroyed them. Some bits lasted only 2 or 3 holes before becoming too dull to cut. The physical toll was immense. Sweat soaked through their clothes by mid-morning, chilling them as the mountain air cooled in the afternoon shade. Blisters formed on their hands within the first hour of work. Those blisters burst. New blisters formed over the raw skin beneath. By the end of the first week, their palms were nothing but callus, thick pads of dead skin that cracked and bled, but no longer felt pain. Their shoulders burned. Their backs ached. The constant rotation of the auger put strain on joints that had never been asked to perform this particular motion thousands of times in a single day. Some accounts mention men wrapping their hands and wrists in strips of cloth, trying to provide padding against handles that were themselves wrapped in leather worn smooth by generations of use. You need to understand what these men were experiencing physically. Picture yourself pushing against a solid wall of wood, rotating a heavy metal shaft, for 12 hours. Picture doing that at elevation, where every breath brings slightly less oxygen than your body expects. Picture doing it in clothes that were never washed, eating food that was barely adequate, sleeping on the ground with nothing between you and the cold mountain dirt but a wool blanket. And through it all, the tree stood unchanged. After a week of work, the damage was barely visible. The wound they had created looked like insect damage on a trunk that had weathered 1,000 years of storms. A passerby might not even notice that humans were trying to kill this thing. The men began to develop a strange relationship with their victim. They gave the tree a name, though which name came first is unclear. Some called it the Big Tree. Others called it the Discovery Tree, because Dowd's discovery had brought them all here. They talked to it while they worked. They cursed it when the bits stuck. They apologized to it during quiet moments when the absurdity of what they were doing seemed suddenly clear. One journal entry from the period describes a moment when the crew stopped drilling to eat lunch in the shade of the tree they were killing. The writer noted that it felt like eating beside a dying giant, someone too big to fail, but failing anyway, brought low not by age or disease, but by the patient malice of ants. 12 days into the operation, they had completed the ring of auger holes, nearly 200 bores, each one 6 to 8 inches deep, circling the entire trunk like a perforated line on a piece of paper. The tree was wounded, but not defeated. The next phase would be even harder. Connecting the holes required the men to insert chisels into each bore and hammer them sideways, splintering out the wood between the cavities. The goal was to create a continuous cut around the entire circumference, essentially sawing the tree from the inside out. The hammering rang through the forest like an irregular bell, strike after strike after strike. The chisels were hardened steel, but even steel bent and chipped against wood this dense. The men learned to angle their blows, to work with the grain rather than against it, to feel when the wood was about to split and redirect their force accordingly. The chips that flew from this work were the size of dinner plates, thick, reddish-brown slabs of heartwood that had been part of a living tree minutes before. The men collected them and stacked them in piles that grew taller than a standing man. These chips would later be sold as souvenirs, pieces of the oldest tree ever killed by American hands, scattered across parlors and drawing rooms from San Francisco to Boston. Some of the workers kept pieces for themselves, small fragments that they tucked into pockets or pouches. Nobody told them not to. The tree was already dead in every way that mattered. These fragments would pass through families for generations, appearing in estate sales well into the 20th century, mysterious reddish wood that great-grandchildren no longer remembered the significance of. But the tree refused to cooperate with its executioners. On day 18, the cut was complete. The men had severed the cambium layer, the living tissue just beneath the bark where water and nutrients traveled between roots and crown. They had cut through sapwood and into heartwood. The tree was technically dead, its connection to the earth permanently broken, and yet it remained standing. The massive weight of the trunk, estimated at more than 1,000 tons, combined with the perfect vertical alignment that a millennium of slow growth had produced, kept the tree upright. The cut ends were resting against each other, the top still balanced on the bottom through nothing but friction and the perfect distribution of mass. Think about what this means. 1,300 years of growth had produced a structure so precisely balanced that even after being cut through entirely, it maintained its position. The forces involved were astronomical, millions of pounds of wood suspended in space through nothing but geometry. For 4 more days, the men tried everything they could think of. They drove iron wedges into the cut, massive steel triangles that they hammered in with sledges until the metal disappeared into the wound. They attached ropes to the upper trunk and pulled with teams of oxen and horses, animals straining against harnesses until the ropes hummed with tension. They widened the cut at strategic points, creating gaps where they hoped the weight would concentrate and tip the balance. Nothing worked. The tree stood as if gravity had forgotten it existed. The nights were the worst. The men would sit around their campfire, looking up at the silhouette of the tree against the stars, knowing that somewhere above them 1,000 tons of wood could come crashing down at any moment. The wind would gust through the grove, and they would freeze, listening for the groan that would signal the fall. It never came. Finally, on the evening of the 22nd day, nature intervened in a way that human effort could not. The afternoon had been hot and still. The men were exhausted, beaten them. Then the wind changed. A cold wind blew. The tree had beaten them. Then the wind changed. A cold front pushed through the Sierra Nevada, bringing air down from the high peaks. The breeze was not particularly strong, perhaps 20 miles per hour, a normal wind, the kind that blew through these mountains every few days. But it was enough. The branches at the top of the discovery tree began to pendulum. Each swing carrying it began to pendulum, each swing carrying it further from vertical. The men scrambled backward, dropping their tools, tripping over stumps and fallen branches in their desperate retreat. They had imagined this moment for 3 weeks. Now that it was happening, they realized they had no idea where the tree would fall or how far the destruction would reach. And then, with a sound that survivors described as a roar mixed with a groan, a screaming of wood and a thundering of air, the discovery tree began to fall. The descent seemed to take forever. The massive trunk arced through the sky like the hand of a clock, slowly at first, then faster as gravity claimed its prize. The upper branches whipped through the air with a violence that seemed impossible for something so large. The impact registered on seismographic equipment at mining camps miles away. They recorded it as an earthquake, not knowing until later that the tremor had been man-made. Birds erupted from the forest in every direction, thousands of them, lifting from trees in a chaos of wings and cries. Animals that had remained hidden throughout the weeks of cutting fled in panic. A cloud of dust and bark fragments rose from the meadow and hung in the air like smoke, taking hours to settle. The men approached slowly, almost reverently. They had been working toward this moment for 22 days. Now that it had arrived, they found themselves reluctant to witness what they had done. What they found was a destruction so complete that it exceeded their imagination. The trunk had shattered on impact. Sections of heartwood had blown outward like shrapnel, embedding in surrounding trees. The crown had disintegrated, branches as thick as normal trees reduced to kindling scattered across hundreds of feet. But the base remained. The stump they had created was nearly 10 feet tall and over 30 feet across. It was larger than the foundation of most buildings in San Francisco, and the cross-section, the flat surface where the tree had been severed, now revealed something no human had ever seen. A complete record of more than 13 centuries, written in wood, The rings told a story that required no translation. Start at the outside and work your way in. Each dark line represents a winter. Each light band represents a summer. Some years were thin, marking drought or fire. Others were thick, marking seasons of abundant rain and growth. The men who made the first count reached 1,344 rings. Later counts by scientists would vary slightly, some finding 1,300, others finding closer to 1,400, so depending on where on the cross-section they measured. But the general conclusion was inescapable. This tree had germinated around the year 500 AD. When this tree was young, the Byzantine Empire was at its height. Muhammad had not yet founded Islam. The concept of Europe as a unified cultural entity did not exist. North America was home to thriving indigenous civilizations that European minds would not imagine for another 1,000 years. The tree had survived the medieval warm period, when temperatures across the northern hemisphere rose enough to allow Vikings to farm Greenland. Its rings showed that period clearly, thick bands of growth marking centuries of favorable conditions. It had survived the Little Ice Age, when temperatures dropped and glaciers advanced. The rings from the 16th and 17th centuries were noticeably thinner, recording the stress of cold summers and long winters. It had survived countless fires. Giant sequoias are remarkably fire-resistant, as their thick bark protecting the living tissue within. The cross-section showed at least 40 distinct fire scars, places where flames had penetrated the bark but failed to kill the tree. Each scar was followed by renewed growth, the tree healing itself over decades. It had survived windstorms, lightning strikes, insect infestations, and diseases that killed lesser trees around it. For more than a millennium, this tree had stood while empires rose and fell, while languages were born and died, and while the entire human conception of history was written. And now, in the summer of 1853, 5 men with hand drills had ended all of it. The scientific significance was immediately apparent, even to non-scientists. Here was a record of climate stretching back further than any written document. Here was proof that the natural world operated on timescales that made human history seem like a single breath. But for Sperry and Lapham, the scientific value was secondary to the commercial potential. They had a story to sell, and the first product they created was the bark. Stripping the bark from the mother of the forest was actually a separate project from felling the discovery tree. But the two events happened within months of each other and became linked in the public imagination. The mother of the forest was the tallest tree in the grove, though not the widest. Rather than cutting it down, Sperry and Lapham decided to remove its bark while the tree was still standing. The bark would be shipped to New York and London, where it would be reassembled and displayed as proof that these impossibly large trees actually existed. A team of workers erected scaffolding around the trunk and spent months peeling bark in sections, each piece carefully numbered so it could be reconstructed later. The work required them to climb more than 100 feet above the ground, prying bark from living wood while balanced on narrow platforms. The labor was dangerous and exhausting, as the men worked in stages, removing bark from lower sections first, then building new scaffolding to reach higher portions. The bark itself was so thick and heavy that lowering each section to the ground required block and tackle systems that strained under the weight. When they finished, the mother of the forest stood naked, its cinnamon trunk replaced by pale wood that would never again photosynthesize, never again grow. The tree died slowly over the following years, or its exposed heartwood eventually succumbing to rot and insects. The bark sections were shipped to the Crystal Palace exhibition in London in 1854. Reassembled into the shape of the original tree, they stood as one of the most popular attractions at the exhibition. Thousands of visitors lined up to see proof of the American giants, but the display also sparked controversy. British newspapers that had initially marveled at the sequoias began to question whether cutting them down was justified. One editorial in the Illustrated London News called the destruction a vandalism against nature, arguing that no commercial exhibition was worth the loss of a living monument. This criticism crossed the Atlantic and found an audience in America as well. For perhaps the first time in the nation's history, significant voices began questioning whether unlimited exploitation of natural resources was actually progress or merely destruction dressed up in the language of improvement. The stump of the Discovery Tree became exactly what Sperry and Lapham had planned. They hired carpenters to level the surface, smoothing out the irregularities left by the falling trunk. They installed a dance floor made of planks cut from the tree's own timber, laying it across the heartwood in a pattern that allowed dancers to move freely while still seeing the rings beneath their feet. They built benches around the circumference, seating for more than 40 people at once. They installed a railing at the edge to prevent visitors from tumbling the 10 feet down to the meadow floor. They printed advertisements in San Francisco newspapers that promised an experience unlike anything in America. Come dance on the stump of the largest tree ever felled. Feel 1,000 years beneath your feet. Marvel at the scale of American nature and American industry combined. The hotel they built nearby, the Big Trees Hotel, Shell became a destination for tourists from across the country and around the world. Horse-drawn stages brought visitors up from the lowlands, a journey of several days over mountain roads that were barely more than widened deer trails. The fare was expensive. The accommodations were rough. None of that mattered to people who had read about the giant trees and wanted to see them for themselves. Visitors would spend a day or two exploring the grove, marveling at the trees that remained, taking measurements and photographs that they would show to disbelieving friends back home. But inevitably, irresistibly, they would gather on the stump. Some came to dance. On weekend evenings, a band would set up on the surrounding benches and play, while couples waltzed across the heartwood. The surface was smooth and surprisingly good for dancing, the dense wood providing a solid floor that did not flex or creak. Contemporary accounts describe the dancing as surreal, festive music echoing through a forest of giants while feet traced patterns across centuries of growth. Others came for worship. Church services were held on the stump on Sunday mornings, congregations gathering to hear sermons about divine creation and human smallness. The ministers used the setting to preach about the majesty of God, pointing to the surrounding trees as evidence of powers beyond human comprehension. Much of the stump, to a spot that had once been of the stump, to a spot that had once been the very heart of a living thing, and they would stop and be still. These visitors often stayed the longest. They would count the rings, tracing their fingers across centuries. They would calculate, using the historical markers that guides had painted on the surface, that this tree had been growing when their ancestors were illiterate peasants in countries that no longer existed. Contemporary accounts describe these gatherings with a mixture of wonder and unease. One visitor wrote that dancing on the stump felt like desecrating a grave, merrymaking atop the corpse of something that deserved mourning. Another described it as proof of American audacity, the willingness to conquer anything, even time itself. The stump became a strange monument, simultaneously celebrating the tree's size and commemorating its death. It was both trophy and tomb. Visitors were encouraged to feel pride in what American enterprise had accomplished, but many found themselves feeling something more complicated. Shame, perhaps, or awe that shaded into grief. Meanwhile, sections of the fallen trunk were cut and prepared for shipment to cities across America and Europe. The largest cross-section, measuring several feet thick and showing the complete ring record, was sent to the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. Another section traveled to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. Others were sold to private collectors, museums in Europe, and traveling exhibitions. The Discovery Tree, which had spent more than 1,000 years in one location, was scattered across the world within months of its death. And the controversy that surrounded the felling of the Discovery Tree and the stripping of the mother of the forest planted seeds that would eventually grow into the American conservation movement. Not immediately, not even quickly. The destruction continued for decades after Calaveras, driven by the same economic logic that had killed the discovery tree. Other sequoia groves were logged throughout the late 19th century, and their timber used for everything from fence posts to grape stakes to railroad ties. The wood was considered inferior for most purposes. It was brittle and prone to splintering, unsuitable for building construction. It burned poorly, too wet and tannic to make good fuel. And yet logging companies cut the trees anyway because they were there, because the land was cheap, and because no one had the legal authority to stop them. The sequoia groves shrank year by year. On trees that had survived the fall of Rome fell to axes wielded by men who had crossed the ocean in search of a better life. The economics were rarely favorable, the wood selling for less per board foot than almost any other timber. But the loggers came anyway, driven by habit or spite, or simply the inability to imagine leaving something valuable untouched. The destruction was not universal. Some groves survived because they were too remote, and accessible only by trails that made hauling timber impractical. Others survived because they happened to sit on land that no one had bothered to claim. Accidents of geography saved more sequoias than any human intention. But the images and stories from Calaveras Grove circulated widely. They appeared in newspapers and magazines across America and Europe. They were discussed in lecture halls and parlors, and they became part of the national conversation about what America was, or what it was becoming, and what it should aspire to be. The British criticism stung American pride with a particular sharpness. Here was the mother country, the nation Americans had rejected and rebelled against, lecturing about respect for nature. Were we simply destroyers? Was there nothing we would preserve? Was the new republic to be remembered as nothing more than a timber colony that had consumed itself? George Perkins Marsh, a diplomat and scholar who had witnessed environmental destruction across Europe, published a book in 1864 called Man and Nature. It was one of the first works to argue systematically that human activity could permanently damage the natural world. Marsh cited examples from around the globe, but his American readers heard in his words an echo of what had happened at Calaveras Grove. Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who had designed Central Park, traveled to California in the 1860s and saw the sequoias for himself. He returned east with a conviction that some landscapes were too important to be left to private ownership. His writings helped build the intellectual foundation for what would become the national park idea. John Muir arrived in California in 1868, a Scottish immigrant who had wandered across the continent seeking wild places. He visited the sequoia groves in the 1870s and wrote passages about them that still resonate today. On standing among the giant trees, he described an experience that was religious in its intensity, a communion with something older and greater than human civilization. Muir explicitly referenced the fate of the discovery tree as an example of what must not be allowed to continue. The fact that the largest tree ever measured had been cut down for entertainment, for dancing and souvenirs and carnival spectacle, was to Muir a moral catastrophe that revealed something broken in the American character. We had found a wonder, and our first impulse had been to destroy it. His writings reached a national audience. They were published in magazines that landed on parlor tables from Boston to Denver. They were read aloud at literary clubs and discussed in college classrooms, and they helped build support for something that had seemed impossible a generation earlier. The creation of Sequoia National Park in 1890 protected the most spectacular remaining groves from logging. Yosemite followed. General Grant National Park, which would later be absorbed into Kings Canyon, preserved still more. The idea that some places were too valuable to exploit, an idea that had been almost unthinkable in 1853, became federal law within 40 years. None of this brought back the discovery tree. The damage at Calaveras Grove was permanent, a wound in the forest that would take centuries to fully heal. But its death contributed to a shift in consciousness that eventually saved its descendants. If you visit Calaveras Big Tree State Park today, you can still see what remains. The stump is still there. It has weathered more than 170 years since the tree fell, but the heartwood remains solid. The rings are harder to count now, obscured by erosion and the footsteps of millions of visitors, but they are still visible if you know where to look. The State Park Service maintains the site with a mixture of historical interpretation and ecological education. Signs explain what happened here. Rangers tell the story to school groups, describing both the wonder of the original tree and the tragedy of its destruction. The meadow where the tree once stood has grown back. Second-growth forest surrounds the stump. Other giant sequoias in the grove continue to live and grow, some of them nearly as old as the discovery tree was when it fell. But you can still feel the absence. Stand at the edge of the stump and look up at where the crown would have been. I'm 300 feet above your head. Try to imagine the living tree that once occupied this space. Try to comprehend that the flat surface you are standing on was once the beginning of something that stretched higher than most buildings you have ever entered. That absence is the point. That is what the site teaches now. Not just how big the tree was, but what it means to destroy something that cannot be replaced. The largest cross-section from the discovery tree currently resides at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. It survived the 1906 earthquake and fire, though barely. Curators had to work frantically to move it to safety as the building burned around them. Today, visitors can stand before the section and trace the rings themselves. The Academy has labeled certain rings with historical markers. Here is the ring from 1215, when the Magna Carta was signed. Here is the ring from 1492, when Columbus reached the Caribbean. Here is the ring from 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed. The tree lived through all of it. The tree was indifferent to all of it. Human history, which seems so vast and important when we study it in books, occupies only the outermost fraction of those rings. The tree had already been growing for 800 years when the first English words were written. Other fragments are scattered across the world. Museums in London and Paris have sections from the discovery tree or the mother of the forest. Private collections hold pieces that have passed through auction houses and estate sales for more than a century. Each fragment carries the same message. This is what we destroyed. This is what we cannot undo. What happened to the men who cut down the discovery tree? History does not record their fates with any detail. They were working men. I'm probably miners or loggers who needed the wages that Sperry and Lapham offered. They spent 22 days killing something that had lived for 13 centuries, collected their pay, and disappeared back into the anonymous mass of Gold Rush, California. They were not villains. They were tools, as much as the augers and chisels they wielded. The villainy, if we must assign it, belonged to a system that placed no value on preservation, and that saw nature as nothing more than raw material waiting to be converted into profit. That system was not unique to 19th century America. It has existed in every human civilization, in every era. The specifics change, but the underlying logic remains constant. What can we take? What can we sell? How fast can we extract value before someone tells us to stop? The difference is that now we know. We have seen the consequences of unlimited extraction. We have counted the rings and understood what we lost. We no longer have the excuse of ignorance that those 5 men in 1853 could claim, and still the destruction continues. Old-growth forests around the world are falling. Species are going extinct. Climate patterns are shifting in ways that may rival the worst droughts recorded in those ancient rings. The discovery tree was a warning written in wood. The question is whether we are capable of reading it. The final ring of the discovery tree was laid down in the spring of 1853. It was thin, barely visible among the hundreds of thicker rings surrounding it. The tree was already under stress when the men began drilling, possibly sensing through some chemical signal that its end was coming. Trees do not have consciousness in any way we understand. They do not feel pain or fear. The discovery tree did not know it was dying as the augers bit deeper into its trunk. But something was lost that summer that transcended any individual tree. What died in Calaveras Grove was not just wood and bark and chlorophyll. What died was a connection to a past so deep that human language struggles to describe it. When that cross-section hit the ground, it exposed time itself. 13 centuries of seasons, of drought and rain, of fire and growth, all compressed into 33 feet of rings. And anyone who stood before that surface was standing before proof that the world is older and stranger and more patient than we can easily imagine. We needed that proof. We still need it. In an era of constant change and relentless speed, we need reminders that some things endure, that some things persist beyond our lives and our children's lives and the lives of generations we will never know. The Discovery Tree was such a reminder, and in 22 days, 5 men with hand drills destroyed it. Where visitors gather to contemplate a simple, devastating question. How did we let this happen? And more importantly, are we letting it happen still? If you found this story as haunting as I did, you might want to see the video about another American monument that was nearly destroyed by the same impulses. That story is on screen now, and if you want to make sure you don't miss the next story, subscribe. I cover the forgotten histories and hidden costs of American progress every week. The past has lessons for us, but only if we remember to look,